All right, everybody. This is going to be the second and final part of our notes on the Civil War. Yesterday, or the last video anyway, depending on when you watched it, we kind of focused on the more social and political aspects of the war. Today's going to be a little bit more about the fighting and the people involved specifically. Some of which we talked about in class and um, and in the last video. So just a reminder, packet on Monday, short quiz over Moodle on Monday over the chapter, and that's going to be that. So um, let's get right to it. So I'll do my best to make this thing a little bit shorter than yesterday, so I won't ramble on, which is exactly what I'm doing right now. So let's go. All right. So this image is one of many famous images from the Civil War that we'll talk about in a minute. This is actually um, remnants of soldiers that died after Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg, which was the major turning point in the war. We'll talk about that later. So, how does war impact society? War always impacts society, usually for the worse more so than the better. Sometimes there's an exception to the rule. You know, the American Revolution was certainly good for American society because it allowed it to grow and flourish. The Civil War has a different effect. Not only is America upset because it's fighting amongst itself, uh, and we know that difference between the North and South in terms of support for the war, but we're also talking about really, really staggeringly high casualty rates. Um, Unlike anything really, any major world wars, this isn't a world war, but major conflicts in the world had seen. Um, Look, typical wars throughout history result in thousands of deaths, a few thousand sometimes. You know, the American Revolution was in the entirety of the American Revolution, there was maybe 20,000 dead between both sides, even less so in the War of 1812. The Mexican War was probably around 5,000 maybe. But the Civil War changes the game in regards to that. The Civil War, when it's all over, estimates the number of casualties from the Civil War range from 700,000 to upwards of 1 million casualties, which is an incredibly high number. And it's staggering to the people that are citizens in the country, not only the soldiers fighting, but um, because every soldier that fights believes that he's not going to be one of the casualties. But to everybody else at home, really, maybe for the first time in history, certainly for the first time in U.S. history, people go off to war, and the ones you leave behind are more genuinely concerned that you're not going to survive. Uh, and not only is it people that die in battle, but you're talking about the other residual effects, the emotional and mental effects of this war, as well as um, debilitating injuries, amputated arms and legs, things like that add to those casualty numbers as well. So the casualties in this war are incredibly staggering, really unlike anything the world had ever seen to that point, and certainly would be surpassed later on by the First World War, which when we get to that, those numbers are incredibly shocking. Um, Part of the reason why casualties were so high, a couple of reasons. For one, you've got military weaponry and technology that has advanced beyond that of military tactics and strategy. For instance, soldiers in their rifles and their guns use something called a mini ball, which was a more accurate and more powerful um, ball, like a bullet, than what we had ever than those like little musket balls that had always been used prior to this time. Part of the reason that the amputations were so high in the war um, was because if it doesn't even need to be in that close enough range, but if you were to directly hit somebody, with your rifle, or shotgun, whatever, with a mini ball, um, that bullet, say it hits you in the arm, is going to shatter the bone entirely. Break it really into two pieces and almost eviscerate that bone to the point where when you did amputations and you had to cut off somebody's arm in the war, you're not really cutting through bone so much. Really, it's just cutting through the muscle tissue that exists. There's the only thing holding the arm up. And the impact of these bullets was so powerful that, like, if it would hit a bone, sometimes the bones would fragment and they would shoot out of other parts of a soldier's body, almost like other bullets. So if you look at a lot of old pictures like this one from the war, you see uniforms of soldiers and they're all beat up and tattered. Reason for that is because soldiers would get hit sometimes and they didn't know where they got hit because they felt they might have been in multiple places. So they're tearing their clothes up trying to figure out where the bullet wound is so they can get attention. But this is obviously something that's just staggering to people. On the flip side of that, you have the invention of baseball. Now, baseball is credited with being invented by Abner Doubleday. He kind of more brought about the concept of professional baseball. But baseball was a popular sport in the 1840s called rounders in northeastern cities. And a lot of the soldiers fighting in the war took it to the war with them as a leisure activity they would do on days they're not fighting. It's not like war is you're fighting every single day. There's down periods. And during these down periods, the soldiers would play baseball. And this makes it a popular game. And then not long after the war, you have the invention of professional baseball, Major League Baseball, the very first team being the Cincinnati Reds, which began operation in 1869. So only 4 years after the war ended. So you can kind of credit the Civil War with the popularity of baseball. And you wonder what the connection there is. Baseball / then professional team sports, which of course are an important part of our culture today. Okay, so the war brings us this. The war also brings us photography, specifically the photography of Mathew Brady, who is the preeminent war photographer. If you see a photograph such as this one from the Civil War, chances are it was taken by Mathew Brady. Photography was a relatively new concept during this time, and Mathew Brady had a shop, like a studio in New York City, where people, I think New York City, where people would come to look at the latest photographs from the war. And this is for the first time really in human history that everyday people could actually see war, could actually physically see the effects of war. And it has an astounding effect on people when you see graphic images like this one and the death and sadness that come as a result of war. Our understanding of war in the past had always been the paintings that are made after the fact, or the stories told by the soldiers that fought. But here, we're looking live, so to speak, at the devastation of war, and that greatly impacts people as well. All right. So the other thing, first thing here we're gonna continue with is talking about the military leadership during the war. And I mentioned yesterday, or in the first video, how different the military leadership was between North and South, and how important that was for the war effort. So we'll start off with the North. So in the North, as we know, we have this long succession of poor Northern generals. The North cannot land, or Lincoln cannot land on a general that is equipped with the ability to genuinely lead this army. He starts off with Winfield Scott, the hero of the Mexican War, old fuss and feathers, but he's old now and too fat to even really be able to get on his horse. So he resigns. He's replaced by a guy named George McClellan. George McClellan is really more of a politician than he is a general. And he would actually run for president against Abraham Lincoln in 1864. McClellan's big problem is he is basically intimidated by the South in many ways, intimidated by Robert E. Lee. And because of this, he's unwilling to make bold strategic decisions that are going to allow for Northern success. Even though they have the numbers advantage in virtually every battle, they can't, that he can't seem to get the win because he just lacks the skill, really, or maybe desire to really push for more success. So from there, you go through another succession of generals. A couple guys, they're unsuccessful. Eventually, they go back to McClellan, who serves a little while longer, still finds no success and victory, and resigns again. He gets replaced by Ambrose Burnside, who's another failure. He got destroyed at the Battle of Fredericksburg. This is where sideburns come from. And Ambrose Burnside had that weird, like, handlebar-like beard thing that went down and then up around your nose. They took to calling those sideburns because his last name was Burnside, and and that was that. He gets decimated at Fredericksburg and resigns after that to be replaced by a guy named Joe Hooker, fighting Joe Hooker. Joe Hooker was no better, kind of pompous and not, but not all that good strategically. What Joe Hooker is most famous for is when the Union Army would be encamped in some place, soldiers would always see these women going into Hooker's quarters at night, and so the soldiers took to calling these women hookers, and that's where the term hooker for prostitute comes from. Ultimately, after about 7 or 8 changes in leadership, Lincoln finally settles on Ulysses S. Grant. And Ulysses S. Grant is a different kind of general. He's not tactically superior to the best generals in the South, but like I mentioned in class yesterday, or at least in a couple of classes, what made Grant stand apart from the others is that he knew how to use the army. Okay, he knew he had superior economic resources. He knew he had more mobility. He knew he had more soldiers. And unlike many of the previous generals who were reluctant to make hard decisions that would mean a lot of people would die, Grant knew that that's what had to happen if the South, or if the North was going to win the war. If the South was going to be defeated, if the North was going to win the war. So he emerges after a few successful battles early in the war and becomes the head general by late 1863. The one other talented general of the Civil War on the northern side was William Tecumseh Sherman. He was Grant's second in command, and when Grant was promoted to overall commander of the Union Army, Tecumseh Sherman took over for Grant and took over his division, his previous command. Sherman was responsible for the March to the Sea, was another unwielding general, skilled and strong strategically, maybe even better than Grant, and really one of the most noteworthy generals in our country's history, right up there with Grant. But you get outside of these two, there's really not a whole lot of great Northern generals. There's a couple others that were pretty good. Winfield Scott Hancock, no relation to Winfield Scott, named after him probably, but whatever. But that's really about it. And, part of the reason why the first 2 years of the war go so bad for the North is because they're unable to find that good leadership. Now in the South, by contrast, you've got really strong Southern generals. Top to bottom, there's not a whole lot of weak Southern generals. The biggest weakness you find in Southern generals, probably, for lack of a better reasoning, would be their lack of character, at least in regards to their feelings about slavery or whatever. But from a tactical standpoint, all of our best generals, many of the guys that were experienced from the Mexican-American War, who had good military talents, they were all from the South. And this helped them win battle after battle, even though they were outnumbered just about every single time. And I'm going to highlight, obviously, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and James Longstreet. This is Stonewall Jackson right there, for a couple reasons. For one, they're arguably the top 3 generals that the South had during the Civil War, perhaps with the exception of Albert Sidney Johnston, who was killed at the Battle of Shiloh in a battle against Ulysses Grant. But Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet stand out as really prominent generals for the South for a couple of reasons. One, they're all very talented in terms of their strategy and strategic talents, tactical talents, but they're also all uniquely good men. We look at the South and say they're all pro-slavery and all that sort of thing. There's plenty of examples in the lives of all three of these men that say that none of them were in support of slavery. In fact, the reason they fought for the South in the war was because their states were Southern states, and again, they felt compelled to go along with their home state. Robert E. Lee had inherited slaves when his father-in-law passed away, gave them their freedom immediately. Stonewall Jackson, Lee and Jackson were from Virginia. Longstreet was from North Carolina. Stonewall Jackson and his wife ran a Sunday school for slave children, so that they could go learn about the Bible and religion when they were, when they had an opportunity to do that. James Longstreet was also an anti-slavery figure as well, not a supporter of the condition of slavery. And they all had different fates. Robert E. Lee, after the war, was basically the guy that got the blame, was next to Jefferson Davis, obviously, kind of the bad guy from the war. But in the South, Robert E. Lee is revered as a heroic figure. Obviously, we hear a lot about the statues and things today, but Robert E. Lee was someone who was a caring man and was a beloved figure by all of his soldiers, right? He's like the old football coach or coach that you'll run through a wall for, you'll do anything for. As punishment for the war, the federal government seized Robert E. Lee's home, and his home, and they turned it into a cemetery for soldiers that died in the war, and they named it Arlington National Cemetery because Arlington House was the name of Lee's estate. The Lee House, if you've been to the Arlington Cemetery, is that yellow house that's in the center of the cemetery there, and they buried all the soldiers there to say, hey, look at what you did, and the lives that were lost because of this war, and he took the blame. Stonewall Jackson was killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville after being shot by friendly fire, after what was arguably his greatest military achievement, and I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. James Longstreet, after the war, kind of went back to North Carolina, but he was basically the Southern, as much as the South loved Robert E. Lee, the Southern failures fell on Longstreet, even though they weren't his fault. In fact, really, they were more Lee's fault than anything else, but nobody would blame anything on Robert E. Lee because he's such a beloved figure. Longstreet takes the blame for a lot of this and becomes kind of like a persona non grata, somebody in the South that they didn't really want around. When Ulysses S. Grant was president of the United States, he named Longstreet his minister to Turkey, so basically his ambassador to Turkey, because they were really good friends from West Point, which then goes into that idea of the relationship between these men on both sides, and how that's just another concept about this war that makes it different than a lot of other ones. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the fighting. This, by the way, is where the signing at Appomattox took place, Appomattox Courthouse, where the war ended in 1865. So it's really a battle of two wars. From 1861 to 1863, as I've talked about before, the South is completely dominant. They win at the Battle of Antietam, the single bloodiest day of the war, kind of win from a tactical standpoint. Is the Battle of Antietam that leads to the Emancipation Proclamation and the resignation of George McClellan as head general. And the losses really kind of keep on coming for the North. I'm going to highlight a couple of the worst. Was the Battle of Fredericksburg is December of 1862. So the one thing we all know about war is you gotta get the high ground. And the biggest mistake you can make in war is to order your soldiers to take a hill when the enemy is on the hill. And that's exactly what Ambrose Burnside ordered his soldiers to do at the Battle of Fredericksburg, and it turned into really a horrible bloodbath. Over 17,000 were killed, mostly Union soldiers, at this battle. Essentially, it's said that Robert E. Lee kind of quietly pleaded with his soldiers, that were like with his other military leaders, his other generals, that the North, please do not attack us on this hill on the high ground. Anakin didn't learn that either. And they do that anyway. And of course, it turns into a bloodbath. Robert E. Lee allegedly cried because he knew what he had to do in the face of the battle. You have to fight back, but he knew because of the advantaged position he had, there was no chance that they were gonna emerge victorious, that the North was. So again, it delves a little bit more into the character of a Robert E. Lee. Maybe the last great victory of the war, arguably, for the South was the Battle of Chancellorsville. This was in May of 1863. And I mentioned before, this is the battle where Stonewall Jackson was killed. But this is where he made maybe his greatest military maneuver. He flanked the Northern Army from behind and attacked like through this grove of trees where nobody expected them to be, and it turned into a quick rout for the Confederacy. And this was the low point after many other lost battles in between, from the beginning of the war through Chancellorsville. The spirit of the North is nearly broken. And a big loss, of course, comes for the South here when Stonewall Jackson is killed, and that is going to change the outcome of the war as well. But here we are in May 1863, and the South is clearly winning this war. The North has virtually no significant victories to their name. But that all changes pretty much on the same day in 1863 with the battles of Vicksburg and Gettysburg. Okay, Vicksburg and Gettysburg happened in July, right at the beginning of July 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg is the turning point in the war for the North. It's also the first significant battle for the South since the death of Stonewall Jackson, and his strategic talents were largely missed in this battle. Robert E. Lee second-guessed himself on several occasions, and it led to a Union victory. In this battle, for instance, the North had the high ground, and the South kind of made a charge up, up this place called Little Round Top. Ironically, the Northern soldiers there, a couple of regiments ran out of ammunition, so they actually made a bayonet charge down the hill that turned out to be successful. Stonewall Jackson's replacement, General Pickett, was obviously the one who was ordered to make Pickett's charge on the third day and the final day of Gettysburg, and that turned out to be a major mistake. It reminded, obviously, the Northern soldiers of Fredericksburg that after they defeated the charge, after they, kind of beat back the charge, Pickett's charge, the Northern soldiers were chanting, Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, because this was like their revenge for what happened at Fredericksburg. The siege at Vicksburg took place over the course of a month and a half, where Grant seized the city of Vicksburg and basically prevented them from getting food and supplies for a month and a half before the city surrendered. Vicksburg was important because it was right on the Mississippi River, and the victory for the Union in this battle gave the Union the control of the Mississippi River, which was really, really bad for the South. Ironically, the Battle of Gettysburg ended on July 3rd, 1863, and Vicksburg actually surrendered on July 4th, 1863. So basically, within the space of 24 hours, the whole war has been kind of flipped on its side through two major victories for the Union. The people of Vicksburg were so upset about about the siege of Vicksburg and what happened that they actually didn't celebrate the 4th of July in Vicksburg again until 1945 to celebrate the end of the Second World War. So that's how upset these people were about that. So in 1864 and 1865, now Grant has this great victory at Vicksburg, and Lincoln gives Grant kind of the lead role in the Army. And again, stuff I've talked about before. He uses his army. He instructs General Sherman to use total war against the South with his march to the sea. Basically, go in, destroy everything, tear up railway lines, burn down houses from Atlanta all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, cutting off supply lines for the South, squeezing them until they can't fight anymore. Same thing at Petersburg. Major siege there that lasted a couple months to break the will of the Confederate Army. And ultimately it works, and we get the end of the war that happens, of course, at Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee surrenders to Grant on April 9th, 1865, and with that, the war is over. Okay, so what is the bottom line for Chapter 14? The Civil War was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The incredible casualty rate showed us that the nature of war was changing, and this would become even more obvious with World War I only 50 years later. So we're getting close to kind of modern times here. While the North won out and slavery came to an end, many of the deep resentments that existed between North and South became even greater, and the economic and social divide between the regions became wider as well. So, basically, the Civil War was something that was probably going to happen in this country over slavery or something else at some point or another. All year we've been talking about the differences between North and South. And the Civil War shows us that the only way to resolve some of those differences in this particular instance over an issue so divisive as slavery is war. And that's ultimately what we get, and that's what happens. So that's it for Chapter 14. I'll give you a few more seconds to finish kind of writing this stuff down here. Obviously, you can always pause the video as well. And that's that. So I'll see you next time.